Hi guys and welcome to my channel. Recently I watched the new Spider-Man No Way Home film without ever watching the previous Spider-Man films. In saying that, I have watched Tom Holland's Spider-Man films. I mean the other franchise movies for Spider-Man. I don't know how, growing up in the early 2000s I never watched them, I just never did. The most I've probably watched of it is if it's on the TV flicking through channels. I've never sat down and watched one, but the Tom Holland ones I've all watched as they've come out in the recent years. And I decided to watch the new film, even though it is about the multiverse and the Spider-Man universe, and it does bring in characters from those universes into this one. I didn't want to watch the films, not because I don't want to watch them or I don't like Spider-Man, but because I wanted to see how much understanding I could get as a general Marvel audience without the understanding from the other films. Marvel normally does quite a good job at setting up its established universe per film, so that you can go into any film and not have every piece of information, but for people who do know everything, they do get a little bonus kick of knowing every single reference that's in a film or a TV show. So I wanted to see how much casual fans could enjoy this film without any understanding from previous ones. So I recently watched No Way Home with no knowledge of other movies outside of Tom Holland's franchise to see how much I would understand about this movie, and this is how it went. First, let's talk about the characters. I'm going to start by talking about our Spider-Man, Tom Holland's Spider-Man. I'm referring to all the Spider-Man because there is 3. I will be saying the actors' names afterwards, just for more context than Spider-Man, because that could get quite confusing quite quickly. So we'll talk about our Spider-Man first. Peter Parker, Tom Holland. This was a big movie for our Spider-Man. He went through a lot of development. He, in the end, ended up losing everybody. He went on a very big character development with the loss of his aunt and his revenge plot on the Green Goblin, and in the end it did end up being his film and his film entirely, with everyone else just being supporting characters as it normally is. They also set up a lot of development for another installment of his Spider-Man. I believe it's confirmed he's getting 6 movies and he'll be the first Spider-Man franchise with more than 3 movies, which is great, good for him. He should be a big part of phase 4. He already has been, but they're really pushing for him to become a bigger character. Especially in the second one, he was supposed to be taking the steps to be the next Tony Stark, but I think they've established pretty clearly that that's not who he is and not what he's going to do. It was an amazing film for Tom. He had a great movie. His costume design was great. A lot of people didn't love it. I did. I think a lot of comic fans had a couple problems with it. The colours were off or something. Doesn't bother me at all. I don't care enough for that. But I think visually his suit was amazing. Visually his effects were great. No complaints at all. Next we're going to talk about Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield is one of the biggest actors at the moment. He's getting a lot of hype for his previous roles. Everyone's come up as a Andrew fan in the last few months, especially since this movie came out. He's been getting a lot of talk. Him and Toby, their Spider-Mans, were introduced into this film, and you could straight away feel the dynamic that all 3 of them had without even knowing each other. They had this sense of connection through being Spider-Man and their like senses and how they can feel things. They all connected very quickly, but they also were all set apart. Where they're supposed to be the same character based off the same comic, they all have very different personalities and mannerisms, and just the way they hold themselves, the way they dress, the way they were introduced, all quite different. Andrew's Spider-Man was introduced in his suit, meaning that he still actively sees himself as Spider-Man, whereas Toby's Spider-Man was wearing normal people clothes with a suit underneath, because I think that's to symbolize his role as Spider-Man is sort of done. He's done his 3 movies, there was a conclusion, it was wrapped up, probably. So he is more of a person instead of a superhero. I think that's what they were trying to portray. Again, I have no context of the other films besides very basic things. But he was introduced very nicely, and I like how he met MJ and Ned before he met our Spider-Man. I think that kind of helps build who he was and his introduction a little bit more. Next we've got Tobey's Spider-Man. The Spider-Man I know the least about. I know he got 3 full films where Andrew only got 2, so I'm assuming his whole plot was concluded and he's sort of done being Spider-Man. I know Andrew Garfield only got 2 films. It's rumoured he might be getting a 3rd, so I'm guessing his story was kind of left a bit open, possibly for room for a 3rd movie, and it just never happened. I believe Tobey is also older. They didn't use any de-aging effects on him, so he looks older than the other 2. He also complains about having a bad back, so I think he's supposed to be the older, more retired Peter Parker. Again, he was introduced with great mannerisms to MJ, Ned, and Andrew's Peter Parker first. He was always very calm. He just says he needs to help somebody. In conclusion, all 3 Spider-Men were introduced or set up in this film very well. You could tell by their different mannerisms, even with the suits on. If they were all wearing the same suit, you could probably tell to some degree who was who most of the time. I did like how they all kept their suit designs very different. I believe they're all from their films, so their own universes. But looking at them, you can just tell who's who based by like the sort of like aesthetic of the suit and how old it felt, so you can distinguish them apart. I think that's an amazing thing for an audience member, especially if you're more casual and haven't watched all 3. You can kind of tell who is who, at least to some degree. You can tell they're not the same person. If they all had the same suit, it might get quite confusing. Next, I'm going to talk about the villains. First, I'm going to talk about Dr. Ock, Dr. Octavius, Doc Ock. I believe he is a part of Tobey Maguire's villains, along with the Green Goblin. To me, they feel more like straight out of a comic book, whereas Andrew Garfield's felt more reality-based and grounded, which I think was just personal choices, directing-wise maybe, for the films. Doc Ock was the first villain introduced and the first sign of the multiverse breaking. He was the first person who didn't belong to come through. Personally, I like how they chose a villain to come through before another Spider-Man. I think if they leaned up straight away with the Spider-Man, the flow wouldn't have been as nice. It wouldn't have led to the ending so smoothly. It would have just felt a little bit more all over the place. But introducing all the villains first, I think, was a right move for them. So he's introduced on the bridge scene while Peter is trying to talk to the MIT advisor to get him, MJ, and Ned into university. He immediately recognizes Peter Parker, our Peter Parker, as Spider-Man and starts attacking him and innocent civilians on the bridge, which Peter saves, I believe, everybody there, including the MIT advisor. The two have the first proper fight scene of the film. But the bridge scene was one of my favorites. It's captivating and wonderful, and it was also right after the spell that Peter caused Doctor Strange to fail at, which also hints at that being the problem that created the multiverse to break, which I know is not entirely true. At this time, I don't believe it's confirmed if Loki and Sylvie or Wanda or Doctor Strange broke the multiverse. I believe it's hinted that they all did at the same time, and that's what really broke it. I believe the WandaVision and the Loki series, the timestamp matched up, so it's believed that they both did it at the same time, or whatever. They all opened it at the same time, so no one can confirm who actually broke the multiverse, but I believe all 3 of them are to blame. The MIT advisor being a part of the fight scene, to me, really helps bind the 2 plots together. It's a Spider-Man movie with villains from another universe, but it's also still Peter's reality, and I think that really binds the 2 plots together. He's introduced in a wonderful fight scene, amazing slow-mo, amazing graphics. His suit looks beautiful, fantastic. I love how the arms come out of the jacket almost. It's not even like a part of him physically, body-wise, but it's part of like who he is. My overall favorite part of this whole scene was that as soon as Dr. Octavius found out that Spider-Man wasn't his Peter Parker, he stopped pretty much fighting him instantly. But as soon as he realized it wasn't his Peter, he no longer had that vicious intent, which I think is what makes him such a great villain, is that he only wanted to hurt the person who he intended on hurting. He didn't want to hurt everybody, which I really liked about his character. Next, we had Peter Parker taking over his arms, his octopus arms, with his nanotechnology. You could tell Doc Ock was very quickly irritated by this, but Peter just kept laughing it off and finding it funny, which I thought was amazing and really captivates the childish side of Peter, because he is quite young. I think he's only 17, maybe 18. Once they've sort of figured out who each other is and they've talked a little bit and they're both sort of very much established a relationship, and Doc Ock as a character is established as well, we get straight into the Green Goblin and his introduction. Very short, he's not in the scene for very long. Later on, when Peter is making cures for everybody, we get Doc Ock being the first one cured, and immediately he's mentally disconnected from his arms. They're no longer taking over. He said he hears voices, whether that's his thoughts, whether it's something to do with the arms, something like that. He says it's so quiet and he almost goes completely calm and relieved, and he no longer wants to fight anyone. He's no longer vicious or angry. He just becomes this very soft man. I think that was an amazing development for him. I think it helps justify and build his character, and eventually will lead to a character arc for him. I think people who have seen previous movies, this may justify his vicious intents that he's had, and I think it does redeem him for a lot of previous problems. While it makes it more justifiable, it's not just because he wants to, it's because he's literally got other voices in his head telling him what to do. And pretty much as soon as he finds out who our Peter Parker is, he's been more or less on Peter's side. He has very few scenes compared to the villains where he's against Peter. The only problem he has at first is being fixed. He doesn't believe in that, but once he is better, he never really turns on Peter. He's always loyal to Peter, whereas everyone else kind of turns on him a bit, especially the Green Goblin and the Electro dude, whose name I still don't know, and I watched the movie yesterday. But he stays loyal to Peter. He always stays as either a neutral or a protagonist character, and he even goes against the Green Goblin a couple times, really reinforcing the idea that he is on our side. So after we're introduced to Doc Ock on the bridge, we next get introduced to the Green Goblin, or Dr. Osborn. I believe he is first introduced not to Spider-Man, our Spider-Man, but to his Aunt May, and I believe he first introduced himself as Dr. Osborn. So we're first introduced to the character side of him. He's the first person we see as a human instead of as a villain, even though Peter first saw him as a villain. That's the first time they interacted, but he's introduced by his human person sort of side. My favourite part about him in this movie, in this role, was the fact that they got rid of his mask. I believe in the previous movie he was in, he had this big green mask. We're introduced to the mask the first time we see him, and we also see him sort of break it or throw it away later on. And whenever he's talking to it, that's got like sort of more of an evil voice and evil persona than his human character, Dr. Osborn. So I love the idea of getting rid of the mask. You could also see more of William Dafoe's facial expressions and his acting, which I think was definitely the right move for Marvel to make, having such an amazing character on the team. You don't want to cover that up with a mask, because you can see a lot of his personality and expression, especially in his smile. You can see him embody the role. I think this really also reinstates the idea that him as Dr. Osborn and him as the Green Goblin are two different clashing personalities that take over in his mind, and it's not just him being a bad person. It's him being taken over by someone else inside his head. Once he is put in the cells along with the other villains, him and Dr. Octavius have a conversation where Octavius mentions that he is a ghost because he was supposed to be dead. And I believe someone mentions that Dr. Octavius was also supposed to be dead. This element I really liked. I'm not really sure why. I think it just, again, goes back to the multiverse sort of theory and the multiverse sort of plot line that they have and have been using. But I like how it hints to there being more than one universe that they all came from. They came from the same universe but different timelines maybe, or they came from different universes where the same things happened but they lived in one or they didn't in the next. He's the one who stops Peter from being able to create any more cures at that time in the plot and switches on Peter once he has more than enough information, and then several others take his lead and they all join in. Dr. Ock disappears. He's also the reason for May's death, which ends up to Peter wanting revenge on him because he believes it is his fault, and also blaming himself, which also sets in motion Peter's character development. Once he goes back to being a villain, or his villain self as the Green Goblin, he has a bit of an outfit change. I believe he gets like a cloak thingy, a cape, and a little bit more different. There's still no mask, which I really enjoy, and he goes back on his little hover flying machine that he previously had. Again, straight away introduced with amazing mannerisms as a character, already half developed from their previous films. They just have to sort of mold them into this film. But he has just amazing acting and all-round facial expression, everything. He just does such a good job. I don't have too much to talk about on the other villains. To me, they weren't as developed as much. Pretty much all the other villains aren't really established or talked about. I wish more villains had come through, even if they hadn't captured them all. I think the final fight scene, they could have had a lot more villains shown up and just all like fought each other, maybe a couple more come through the rift. I think it just would have added to the heightened element of threat, because 3 Spider-Men would be quite a powerful force to reckon with, considering how they've all fought people previously and like the dangers they've been in. I feel like 5 villains they were fighting, maybe 6, wasn't enough for them. Even though it was the right power level for that film, I feel like they could have been more of an immediate threat and build up and shock factor if there was more of them. That's just me personally. I also think it would have been fun to see characters outside of the movie franchise, like comic book characters, come into it. I think if you're gonna make a movie like this, you may as well go all out, and I think Marvel, they did do things that no other film franchise had really ever done before. They brought Spider-Man from different universes with different production companies together, and it's something that'll never be repeated or recreated ever again, but I feel like they could have gone a bit more all out with the villains. I also think besides the Green Goblin and Dr. Octavius, the other 3 or 4 villains that are there aren't developed as much at all. Electro's the only other character that's kind of developed and has he's more of an active villain in this series, and he wants to take over Tom Holland Peter Parker's Spider-Man's world because he loves the energy surge he gets there. Other than that, the other villains weren't really developed, didn't do much for me. But the two that were developed, Dr. Octavius and the Green Goblin, I think were amazing characters. I just would have liked to see some more development in the other ones. Dr. Murdoch, Mr. Murdoch also made a cameo appearance, which a lot of people online freaked out about. I don't know why they like him so much. I believe he is one of the people and protagonists, like Daredevil or something like that. I believe he's in his own series where he's got his linked role that he's bigger and a part of. So a lot of people really liked him. The next character I'm going to talk about is just going to be very briefly, is going to be Ned. Him having powers or being magic or being able to do what Doctor Strange can do with no training, which Doctor Strange went through for a very long time, and him saying his nana, his nan, his grandmother had magical powers and no, he was wearing a ring, so that might have helped. I think might be a big setup for the next season. There was a line where Ned said he would never fight Peter or be a villain to Peter or turn on Peter and would always be his friend. But since he's lost his memory and now has magical powers, I believe there could be a setup for him to be a villain in one of the next movies. Possibly with Zendaya as well. I don't know if she'll ever be a villain, but that would be amazing for her. So I don't know if giving Ned magic is to give his character a lot of development, either in future Spider-Man movies or maybe even future Doctor Strange movies. I don't know. But I think that will lead to something much bigger later on. The next character I want to talk about is Aunt May. She wasn't given a lot of screen time. She wasn't given any real importance to the plot besides her death, which is pretty normal for a background character. I believe her death is sort of similar to the other two Spider-Men. They both had an Uncle Ben instead of an Aunt May, and they both died, and their last words were the same as Aunt May's. So in some ways it was a bonding experience for all the Peters, while also being very important for our Peter's character development and the plot as well. Having her killed by the Green Goblin, a man she was trying to help scenes prior to, I think really just speaks about her character and her morals and how she wants to help everyone. She runs a help center. I think it's helps like homeless people and stuff like that, a shelter kind of. So she's always seen as a very selfless person who believes in helping everyone, and she does try her best to pass it on to Peter, which is what I think he needs in that time. And then having her die, he kind of lost sight of his morals. All he wanted was revenge. He didn't care as much, but through the help of the other Peters, he gets over his grief quite quickly and does develop this. It also leads to the ending of him being completely alone, which is exactly where I think Peter Parker needs to be at this point in his film progression for development in the next probably 3 films. I think having him alone will really help his character development and become possibly a different kind of character than we've ever seen before in the Spider-Man franchises. If it's called Spider-Man Home Alone, I swear to God. The next and last character I want to talk about is Doctor Strange. As a huge Benedict Cumberbatch fan, I'm not the biggest fan of Doctor Strange and his character. I think he always comes across as rude and arrogant. I think he always comes off as condescending and higher than everyone. There are some scenes where he's an amazing character, but in a lot of them, especially in this Spider-Man film, he didn't add much to it besides being a general nuisance to me. I know a lot of people aren't going to like hearing that, but he immediately blames everything on Peter. I know Peter tried to change the spell several times, but I feel like that could have been resolved by him just telling him beforehand. And, you know, any sort of communication with Peter. So to me in this film, in this film in general, he was less of a protagonist than he has been in previous films. In previous films, he's been the main protagonist, completely morally right, absolutely wonderful character. But in this film particularly, which already has the main protagonist, Peter Parker, he was not seen as a joining force. To me, he sort of seemed like an advisor or a nuisance or another, almost not villain, but like a neutral character. All of Peter's villains were from different universes, so I think having a character from his universe be a clashing component, I think that really helps tie in all the plots together. He does try and help Peter, but when that doesn't go through with his spell, he immediately blames him. Doesn't help him at all to capture the villains, he just leaves it for him to do. Sort of like pick up your own mess, but at the same time he did help create that mess. It was his spell that went wrong. Not helpful at all. And then as soon as Peter said he wanted to keep them to help them, morally help them do the right thing, Doctor Strange had no interest in it. He was just again trying to save his own skin. He had no interest in actually helping these people or Peter. I think it's very easy to see Marvel protagonists as just protagonists and not giving them any depth or any moral grey areas, putting them very much up on a pedestal. So I think having this movie for Doctor Strange not be just him being morally right the whole time, I think it's a beautiful development for his character and it's a nice change It's similar to what they're doing with Wanda. A lot of things she's doing, if anyone else did them, would be seen as protagonist sort of movements because everyone's been put on a pedestal, but because she's morally more grey than everyone else, they've built that character up for her and that depth within her character. So she's seen as more of a vilified protagonist, or even to some degree an antagonist. It looks like that's what it would be like in the new Doctor Strange film. So I think that's what they're trying to do, is they're purposefully making him less of a beloved character and taking him off that pedestal and being like, he still isn't the best person ever. So I really did enjoy that. Benedict Cumberbatch's acting has always been phenomenal. He does a great job. He was the right person for Marvel to give that role to. I don't think anyone else could do Doctor Strange the way he does. Fantastic. The other thing that kind of villainizes Doctor Strange in my eyes, I'm not calling him a villain, I'm saying in this movie he was morally grey, maybe given some more villainy plot lines, character traits. He just wasn't overall the good guy of the film because we already had our good guy Spider-Man, so they obviously have to get an opposing force to go against that. Otherwise it's just going to be quite a boring film. So they have him be one of the problems in this universe, which I think is perfect. I wouldn't want it any other way, and I think that is just amazing for Doctor Strange's character. The scene that really reinforced this to me was the fight scene where they split into the mirror universe, I think he calls it, which is a similar one that we saw in the Doctor Strange franchise, where it's got kaleidoscope effects, it's got mirror effects, it's got like the glass breaking effects. They're running on a train at some point. He's got him falling through the Doctor Strange circles. That's absolutely not what they're called. It was quite a nice contrast compared to the bridge fight scene, which felt very grounded, justified, normal, kind of like a basic Spider-Man superhero fight scene. Cars being thrown everywhere, screaming noises. I think there was fire at one point, maybe one of the cars caught on fire or something. Saving people falling off the bridge, very standard stuff. This fight scene was a lot less standard. They had like the mirror effect and the multi-dimension. They're both fighting with magic and also not magic, and Peter can react differently than most people do in that ultimate dimension. I think that's related to his spider sense, I don't know. I think it also makes you realise how powerful Spider-Man is. While he's normally not seen being too powerful, it's his web, it's his suit doing a lot of the work. He goes up against very basic villains. There was that time on that ferry and he needed saving because he couldn't do it because he wasn't as powerful. The same way that other characters are, whereas Doctor Strange and Wanda are probably considered the most powerful characters because they have magic that allows them to be powerful. Everyone has very different qualities, so it's hard to figure out who is actually the most powerful, especially when some people are like superheroes with like altered personalities, radiation, magic effects, whatever. Peter Parker is essentially a kid from Brooklyn in a Spider-Man suit. But it was nice to see just a kid in a fancy suit fighting an actual magical human being. I know it's not magical, but you know what I mean. Doctor Strange. And it really showed a juxtaposition between their powers and how they could fight each other, and Spider-Man was very much able to keep up with Doctor Strange to almost every degree, and even wins that fight, really, leaving him strung up. So it was nice to see the two major heroes of Phase 4 fighting each other in a way that was different to how in the original phases, Tony Stark and Captain America and all that, they didn't always get along, but that was more of a personality clash, whereas this was a moral clash, and I think it was a very nice fight scene. Alright, that's characters done. Let's get straight into the plot. Next I want to talk about the major fight scene. The scene on top of the Statue of Liberty where all three Spider-Men are Spider-Maning together. We get great bonding, we see them all have a beautiful relationship and dialogue between them, and it's wonderful. But at first they're sort of clashing, they're not understanding each other, the communication's off, they're just not getting where they want to get, they're not fighting the villains together, they're doing it very individually. They're not winning this fight at that point, and then they take a moment, they figure things out, a beautiful swell-in score, and they all jump off at the same time and swing, and it's an amazing scene. I did feel almost this childlike joy inside me watching that scene, watching these three grown men swing off the Statue of Liberty with this beautiful Spider-Man score swelling up behind them. Fantastic scene, groundbreaking scene, will never be repeated kind of scene. I also like how it took place on the Statue of Liberty, giving us plenty of height, plenty of dimension to swing around in, to build in, to jump between layers. I think that was a very nice fight visually and conceptually, gives them a lot more space to work on, and also the added element of difficulty of being on levels and heights and splits and construction work all over the place. It's a stunning scene overall with beautiful camera work, and the lighting is amazing. It's perfect. It just works so well. The score in the background, how the characters get along, how they all get to cure their villains so that everyone can move on and get closure either from their movie finishing or possibly getting a new movie. Either way, it's a very nice wind down for the film. We also get MJ's fall. We have her fall off the Liberty statue, and instead of Peter being able to catch her, which would have been a visually phenomenal scene and would have made sense because everyone in their movies has had that scene, we get Andrew's Spider-Man catch her instead, which I think that was supposed to be closure for him after he killed his MJ, Gwen Stacy. He gets quite emotional, he's almost crying. The score is amazing. Zendaya looks freaked out. She asks him if he's okay, even though she's the one that just fell off the building. And you can kind of see the restoration of faith in himself in that scene, and he gets amazing closure, and it's just beautiful. During this scene, we also have Peter face off with the Green Goblin, who eventually gets on the ground and is beating him basically almost to death. He probably would if he was very much allowed to. And for this, I think this was supposed to be Peter's low point, besides the moments after Aunt May's death. And then Toby comes in and sort of stops him, sort of like a big brother role, I know what you've been through and I don't want you to go through what I went through sort of moment. Almost saving him from himself, and also saving the Green Goblin, who gets rescued moments later. But before he gets fixed, rescued, saved, he stabs Toby's Spider-Man, which again is him betraying a person who saves him because he has no moral obligation to protect anyone. He's putting himself first, he's being a major villain character, but as soon as he switches back, I believe he says, "What did I do?" And he has this wave of sadness and this look of just emotional upset sort of. And then having his amazing switch between his characters and he's back to Norman, that's his conclusion and his character development done. Toby's Spider-Man was a fake out stab. He doesn't actually die. I believe he's quite injured, but there is no death scene. It's just him and Andrew holding on to each other. I'm glad he didn't die. I really was expecting him to die. When he got stabbed, I was like, I knew it, and it's not a fake out. And then it was. The final scene in the movie, the goodbye scene, was really emotional and also sets up the next phase for Peter. No one remembers him. Everyone's disappeared. All the villains have gone back. He's all alone. He seems to be doing fine. He goes to find MJ and Ned and tell them who he is, and obviously decides not to. Once he sees they're in MIT, they're happy, and she still has an injury from an event she doesn't remember, obviously, above her eyebrow, which he can see. And he's about to tell her until he sees that, and then realizes she's safe and not knowing, which honestly was worse. It was heartbreaking, but she was still wearing the necklace that he gave her. So I think there is still a sign of hope. Either those two are going to become villains and it's going to be fucking amazing because they'll be living up to their acting potential, or they will come back as regular characters and he'll have this big moment winning them both back, and it'll be a fantastic either way. Would love to see him as villains though. And then we see him get an apartment. He's all alone. It reminds me very much of what I imagine the original Spider-Man films are like. He's more by himself. He doesn't have a big team behind him. He doesn't have a millionaire suit. It's just him. Friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, boy in Brooklyn, just doing what he has to do. It's not some big, huge superhero recruitment scheme thing. We also see him making his own suit, sort of just sewing one. Bright colours, very nice. I do love the bright colours. I don't love the black suit. I love the traditional bright red, bright blue Spider-Man suit. I think that's what it should be. It's what it should be. It's what it should be. And I think it will be amazing to see Peter as a new developing character as himself, building up a plot, building up an arc, building up who he is now. I think it will be amazing to see him do that by himself, without family behind him, without friends, without Tony Stark and the Avengers, without anyone remembering who he is. Next, I just want to talk about this film's place in the MCU and how tying in, I believe Sony does the previous Marvel films, how tying in those Sony films helps build this film alone and the universe is in. So obviously it's the multiverse and the multiverse alone that allows us to have this film. The multiverse was previously mostly set up in Loki, but also WandaVision, two TV shows that previously came out before this. And then I know it's been touched on in previous Marvel films. So having the multiverse be real, which also happened in Spider-Man Into the Multiverse, which is a different animated series not linked to this, except for the reference to a black Spider-Man. I think that was supposed to be hinting at that, which is amazing. We love, what's the word I love? we love representation. So having the multiverse set up in previous franchises, TV shows, movies, it's pretty much since day one I think been mentioned. Ties in sort of the comics, it ties in other franchise movies such as the other Spider-Man movies, how they're made by different producing companies. It ties everything in and does this beautifully neat wrapped film. Without the multiverse breaking or becoming a part of this, there would be no way to actually incorporate these other Spider people into this movie with it making sense. So I think having the multiverse and having the multiverse breaking was just the perfect move for Marvel and the next phase. Now incorporating those films into the MCU was the right move for Marvel, and probably where they want to take things from now. It also just ties in any loose ends, makes more sense. And people love things with nostalgia, so having those characters come back is a lot of nostalgia for older people, or even younger people who just had Spider-Man as part of their childhood, which means they could make a lot of revenue and a lot of profit off this film. In general, this film was very easy to understand as someone who hadn't seen previous Spider-Man movies outside of Tom Holland's franchise. There were some things I probably missed and went straight over my head and I didn't get. Some of the villains weren't as developed as I'd like them to be. Only two really stayed in my mind and to me felt properly developed with a character arc and a conclusion and everything. Everyone else was just sort of, for lack of a better term, boring or less interesting or had less of a motive to be there. And we also aren't really told which universe they come from. We don't know if they belong to Andrew's Spider-Man universe or Tobey's Spider-Man universe until the final scene where I believe they all say goodbye to their own villains. I wish they'd done more comic book villains and not just had the ones from the basic movies. I wish there'd been more villains than just the 5 or 6 that were introduced. I wish there was maybe if not, they didn't all have to be developed. They could have had 5 main ones and then just some there. I think it would have been a nice reference to comic book fans. I also wish they had some form of hinting at Miles Morales, even if it wasn't animated, just having the representation for children. If you're gonna have a multiverse Spider-Man movie, I think it would have meant a lot to a lot of people to have a black Spider-Man on the screen. So I'm kind of disappointed that they didn't do that. I wish they'd done the multiverse characters similar to how they did the Loki multiverse characters. They had some from actual actors from old Loki series. They had just some that were meant to be out of the comic books. There was some they developed themselves. I believe Sylvie was still available. No, Sylvie was a comic book. I just wish they'd had more of that interesting dynamic of comic book onto a movie screen. Everything is also explained character to character, so there's no monologue, there's no reading, there's no prologue, there's no dialogue over the film. It's Tobey's Spider-Man telling Peter's Spider-Man what the audience needs to know, so it's built into the script, and they'll be having a conversation between themselves, which is giving us all the information we need. I like how they set up all the villains without telling us really their previous villain history. We don't know. As someone who's never watched those films, I don't know what Doc Ock previously did, I don't know what the Green Goblin previously did, I just know they fought Spider-Man and didn't get along with Spider-Man, which I think is enough for me to know. I just need to know that their intention is we don't like Spider-Man, and I think that was wonderfully done, so it wasn't boring, there was not a lot of monologue, but we still understand the concept of what they're supposed to be, even if we don't understand every single thing we've previously seen about them, because then the people who have watched those movies are just going to get bored. Don't understand. And theoretically, most people going into this movie should have seen all the movies, but obviously not everyone has. So I think it's nice to have it set up so that people who love Marvel and have watched every single movie and have watched the original Spider-Mans can get everything, but also as a standalone film, if you just walk in, watch that movie, you know nothing, you would be able to get enough out of it to understand 90% of things. Doctor Strange is probably the most confusing thing in there. The CGI, the acting and the score were all phenomenal throughout the whole film. The costume design, script writing, everything, set work, actors, plot lines, character development, the conclusion, the setup for the next film, theoretically, all amazing. I think this film is one of the best general hero films to ever come out, finish to end. The plot's amazing. Spider-Man has always had amazing plots in the MCU. I don't know about outside the MCU, but in the MCU, his stories, I feel like I've always liked the plot more. It's more grounded, it's more, this is this person's life and there's problems in the life. A lot of effort was put into this film when no matter what, people probably would have watched it because Spider-Man is such a well-known, beloved film character. So Marvel has done a fantastic job adapting previous films into this film, which exceeded everyone's already very high expectations for this movie. And it was easy to understand to everyone as far as I'm concerned. I understood it. I feel like I understood it as much as the next guy. The person who is a die-hard Marvel fan, read every comic, watched every movie, would probably get a little bit more, but not too much more. Like, it wasn't confusing, it wasn't the way they did it was amazing, and I have nothing but respect for them for the way they made this fantastic and beautiful movie. If you like this video, please click the subscribe button down below. I'm nearly 1.1k and I really do appreciate the support I've been getting. This is my first video essay that I have done. If it does well, I'll probably do more in the future. I did quite like the format of this and getting to sit down and write out an analysis of the film. If I missed anything or if anything you'd like to add, please comment below. I reply to every single comment I get. You can like the video as well, it just helps me see how many people enjoy what I'm making. I've got my social medias linked below, and I also have a GoFundMe page, which is to help support me because I don't currently make money off my YouTube channel to buy new equipment. And half the money I earn from donations I will be giving back to my local community. There's a couple companies and individual people that work in the film industry where I live in Western Australia that I'd like to support and give back to. So far I've raised $155 and I can't thank you guys enough.